They said a medieval cook lived with one hand in the fire and the other in the law's shadow. In the great towns of Europe, London, York, Norwich, Paris, the streets woke long before the bells did, and the first sound was not prayer, but the scraping of iron ladles against boiling pots. By sunrise, the cookshops were alive. For most people, these rooms were not luxuries, they were survival. Homes rarely had hearths large enough for cooking, many had none at all. So the city ate in the open. Pies wrapped in coarse paper, broth ladled into wooden bowls, skewers of meat sizzling on metal grates. Thousands depended on these cooks, workers, travelers, the poor who owned no pot. Even the wealthy, when guests arrived unannounced and the household kitchen could not answer quickly enough. But the cooks themselves lived in a world far more fragile than the meals they served, because in these same towns a single dish gone wrong could end a career or a life. They worked under eyes that never looked away. Aldermen, inspectors, guild masters, and the crowd itself. A pie too cold, a fish not fresh enough, a broth reheated from the night before, any rumor of carelessness could summon the city's officers. And the punishment, when it came, did not happen quietly, it happened in public. So each morning, as the cookshops stirred awake, the men behind their counters stepped into a day where every ladle, every cut of meat, every choice of spice carried a risk no one else tasted. A risk that could lift them or send them to the pillory. Most people in medieval towns did not cook at home. Not because they didn't want to, but because their houses simply weren't built for it. A survey from 1301 in Colchester found that only 3% of taxable homes had a kitchen of any kind. 3%! The rest lived in single-room dwellings where smoke from a cooking fire would cling to the ceiling until the air turned black. Fuel was expensive, pots were rare, and a chimney, if you had one, was a privilege. So the city turned outward for its meals. Streets became corridors of heat and noise, lined with open hearths and small ovens. Some shops specialized in pies, others in fish. Some sold nothing but broth. And some, the ones people spoke of softly, sold dishes whose smell alone revealed yesterday's failures. In these cookshops, the rules of the city tightened. Officials monitored prices, guilds inspected ingredients, and neighbors never stopped watching. Because the meal you bought today might reveal what the cook did yesterday. A cold pie meant reused meat. A thin broth might hide scraps bought illegally from the waste barrels of wealthy homes. And reheating food, something any home cook today might do without thought, was not just frowned upon, it was a crime. The streets fed the city, but the same streets also held the power to accuse. And for cooks, that meant something else entirely. The public's hunger kept them in business, but the public's suspicion could end everything. A cookshop could be as simple as a wooden stall, or as elaborate as a permanent storefront with benches and steaming cauldrons. Some had portable ovens mounted on wheels, early versions of street food carts. Others operated from small rooms no larger than a stable, their walls blackened by years of fire and grease. But what mattered was not the building, it was what came out of it. The most common dish was the pie, the medieval answer to fast food. It could hold anything: beef, goose, eel, figs, apples, raisins, marrow, herbs, even spices like cinnamon or nutmeg if the buyer could afford them. Rissoles, small fried pockets, offered fruit or meat depending on the day. Broths simmered in great iron pots, roasted meats turned slowly on spits, and in some towns waffles and wafers were sold in the evenings by men carrying trays through the streets. Cities even developed culinary neighborhoods. London had streets called Cook Row and Cock Lane, where the smell of hot fat drifted between shops packed shoulder to shoulder. But no cookshop was immune to scrutiny. A pie that seemed too pale, a fish that smelled faintly of the river rather than the sea, a broth drawn from a pot that had sat too long, any of these could spark whispers. And whispers mattered, because a whisper in a medieval town could travel faster than a horse, faster than a bell, sometimes faster than the truth. The cookshops fed thousands, but they also stood one rumor away from ruin. No trade in a medieval city operated without oversight, but cooks lived under the heaviest hand. Their guilds set rules not just for quality, but for morality. Inspectors, sometimes called searchers, walked the streets and announced, lifting lids from pots, slicing into pies, and demanding to smell whatever fish lay waiting in the kitchen. The city's aldermen set prices. A cook could charge 1 penny to turn a capon into a pie, no more. Violating that rule could mean fines, confiscation, or worse. And then there were the customers themselves. The people who depended on the cookshops were the same people who policed them. If a man fell ill after a meal, whether from spoiled meat or simply from bad luck, the cook would be named before the cause was known. This system did not rely on patience, it relied on speed. Evidence might be a smell, a color, a texture, a story told by a neighbor. And sometimes, by the time the cook had a chance to defend himself, the officers were already at his door. The fear was not abstract. Records describe cooks dragged from their shops for selling stinking flesh, for thickening broth with illegal scraps, for buying leftovers from aristocratic households and repackaging them as fresh. The city claimed it was protecting the public. The public believed it was protecting itself. But for the cook, the man behind the ladle, every day began with the same thought: what if today is the day my food betrays me? In a medieval cookshop, reheating food from the previous day was not cutting corners, it was a punishable offense. The logic was simple: fresh meat was unstable. Once cooked, it still had hours, not days, before it soured. And once soured, it could not be saved. So cities banned the practice altogether, not just discouraged it, banned it. Food had to be cooked and sold on the same day. Anything left at night had to be discarded. If a cook reheated a stew or revived a pie from the previous evening, he was seen not as wasteful, but as dangerous. Officials believed that reheating masked decay, and in an age without microscopes or germ theory, the public agreed. This meant that cooks lived with a brutal economic truth: misjudged the day's demand, and they lost money; misjudged the next day's breakfast, and they risked arrest. Some tried to sell the leftovers cheaply to laborers, others hid them behind fresh batches. But if a searcher caught even a hint of the previous night's food, the charge was immediate: corrupt victuals, a phrase that could change a man's life in minutes. And if he argued? If he pled that the meat still smelt fine, that the broth still boiled clean? The city had a simple answer: if it is yesterday's, it is wrong. Spoiled meat was the medieval city's deepest fear. It spread sickness fast, and when people died, the blame did not fall on chance. It fell on the man who served them. In 1351, a London cook named Henry de Paslew was accused of selling a putrid capon pie. The officers marched him through the streets with the offending pie hung around his neck. a spectacle meant to warm everyone who watched. He was placed in the pillory. Crowds gathered, and the rotten food was thrown at his head as punishment. Cases like this were not rare. Records mention cooks punished for selling sour broth, for disguising spoiled fish with spices, for mixing old meat with new to stretch a day's profit. To ensure fairness, or at least the appearance of it, cities created a strange system. If 8 cooks examined the meat and agreed it was spoiled, the accused was punished. If they declared it sound, the accuser was punished instead. The law trusted the judgment of those who understood the trade, but trust did not soften the consequences. A single mistake, a single misjudgment of freshness, could drag a man from his shop to a wooden frame in the city square, his livelihood destroyed not by weapons or war, but by a piece of meat that turned too soon. For cooks, the boundary between feeding a city and betraying it was as thin as the skin on a simmering broth. Cooks walked a financial tightrope. Meat was costly, flour unpredictable, fish subject to the tides and to the men who controlled the markets. A capon, a fattened rooster prized for pies, could cost 6 pennies, about 2 or 3 days' wages for an ordinary worker. Turning that capon into a pie cost 1 penny by law, no matter how long the cook worked, how much fuel he burned, or how busy the day had been. But the real strain came from the largest truth of all. Food swallowed merely 70 to 80% of a poor family's income. Most customers counted every coin. If a pie cost 1 penny, that penny could not be wasted. So when a meal disappointed, even slightly, the anger ran deep. A pie that cost so much to the buyer had to be flawless, and a cook who failed to meet that expectation could lose not just the sale, but his reputation. Some days the cookshops overflowed. Some days the ovens sat hot and useless as the streets emptied, wages ran thin, or weather kept customers indoors. Yet the expenses never paused: fuel, spices, ingredients, labor, repairs. So a cook learned to judge demand with painful precision. Too little food meant missed profit. Too much meant leftovers he was forbidden to sell. The city ate well when fortune aligned, but the cook, the man behind the heat, lived on the edge of every choice. Reputation in medieval towns was currency, and cooks traded with it daily. Unlike noblemen, they had no land to guarantee their future. Unlike merchants, they had no ships or caravans traveling far beyond the city walls. Their wealth lived in something far more fragile: trust. A trusted cook could feed hundreds. He could serve guild feasts, prepare meals for travelers, even provide dishes to noble households when time was short. A distrusted cook stood alone. The public judged with brutal speed. A rumor could ruin a week. A bad batch could ruin a year. A charge of spoiled meat could ruin a life. This is why medieval literature paints cooks with suspicion. In the Canterbury Tales, Geoffrey Chaucer describes one as unclean, dripping with corruption, his food unfit for the gullible who bought it. The stereotype stuck not because all cooks were careless, but because the margin between honesty and accusation was razor thin. So each morning, a cook stepped into his shop not just to sell food, but to defend a reputation built pie by pie, day by day. A reputation that could disappear faster than any flame he could kindle. It is easy to imagine that street food belonged to the poor, but medieval records tell a different story. In 1170, the writer William Fitzstephen described London's cookshops feeding both rich and poor alike. He noted that nobles bought ready-made dishes whenever guests arrived unexpectedly, a common occurrence in a world where hospitality was reputation and kitchens needed hours to prepare even simple meals. Travelers, too, depended on cookshops. In 1267, a knight named Sir Roger Laburn bought 68 capon pies while travelling through Canterbury, evidence of how essential these shops were for long journeys. And foreign visitors marveled at the variety. In Paris, vendors sold everything from pea puree to garlic sauces, from sweet rissoles filled with figs to savory pastries stuffed with eels. Street food was not a mark of poverty, it was a mark of urban life. Cities grew dense, homes shrank, firewood costs rose, labor divided, specialization flourished, and the result was a world where cooks became the heartbeat of a city, feeding nobles, merchants, pilgrims, apprentices, and beggars alike. Yet the same cooks who sustained everyone walked daily under the threat of punishment. The more the city depended on them, the more unforgiving it became. By now, the pattern becomes clear. The city could not live without its cooks, and the cooks could not live without the city. But the relationship was never equal. A single mistake, a misjudged fish, a sour broth, a pie pulled too late from the oven, could summon officers, guild masters, and spectators who came not to see justice, but to see shame. The pillory stood at the center of many towns. A wooden frame, a platform, a spectacle. It was meant for thieves, cheats, public offenders, and cooks. Because when food failed, the city saw not a human error, but a moral one. Feeding the public was an act of trust. Breaking that trust deserved humiliation. So the cook walked to his stall each morning knowing that his fate balanced on things he could control and many he could not. The tide that brought fish too late, the merchant who sold him meat of uncertain age, the weather that spoiled ingredients faster than expected, the customer who blamed yesterday's illness on today's pie, a world that depended on him yet allowed him no margin for failure. And still he lit his fires, still he mixed his dough, still he sliced onions and salted meat and ladled broth into bowls that warmed cold hands before dawn. Because for all its danger, cooking was the work that held the city together. A city without kitchens, held aloft by men who risked everything every time they opened their doors. And all it took was a wrong meal, a single ordinary dish, to turn the proud's hunger into judgment. A judgment carried out not in whispers, but in the pillory's cold embrace. Today, the medieval cookshops are gone. Their fires extinguished, their streets widened, their smells replaced by engines and electricity. But the world they shaped still lingers in ways few notice. Cities still depend on people they rarely see, people who feed strangers, who wake before dawn, who carry the quiet weight of a public that expects perfection and forgives slowly. The medieval cook lived in that shadow every day, a man whose work made a city possible and whose errors made him expendable. He fed a world that judged him as quickly as it ate. And in the long memory of history, his story survives for the same reason his food once did. Because in the smallest acts, a pie sealed with care, a broth stirred before sunrise, a meal served to someone who could not cook their own, we glimpse the fragile trust that held medieval life together. A trust measured not in praise, but in risk. And for those cooks, risk was the price of feeding a city.